Hello and welcome to the Shakespeare podcast. This is the story of Macbeth. So the play starts off with the witches. It's the witches that we want to see. But really it's only a motif that's opening the play. We get to see the witches and then the witches disappear. And the play really begins at the scene of a battle. And we don't get to see the battle. We're on the sidelines watching the battle. Duncan, who's the king, his kingdom is in the balance. And we don't know what's happening during the battle. We can't tell who's winning and who's losing. And then along comes the captain, who's covered in blood. And he tells Duncan and his entourage that they're winning the battle against the Norwegians and the traitorous Thane of Cawdor, and that the reason they're winning is largely because of Macbeth. He's the real hero of the battle because he's killed lots of people. His sword smoked with bloody execution, and that's what helped them win the battle. He's the hero at this point. And Duncan says that Macbeth should get the Thane of Cawdor's title. He should become the new Thane of Cawdor. So what we can see here is that Macbeth is very height. He's the hero, and he's become the hero through killing people. Then we see Macbeth and his best friend Banquo coming back from the battle, and they happen to bump into the witches, who tell Macbeth that he's going to become the Thane of Cawdor, and that then he'll be made the king, and that Banquo will be the father of kings. So and the witches disappear. At that very moment, Ross appears, the Thane of Ross, to tell Macbeth that the king has made him Thane of Cawdor, just like the witches predicted. And Macbeth is already thinking, well, if they were right about that, then they could be right about Macbeth becoming the king. Then the king, Duncan, is talking to his son Malcolm. And as Macbeth and Banquo arrive, he announces that Malcolm is to become his heir, the Prince of Cumberland. And Macbeth thinks to himself, okay, that's going to be a problem if I'm going to be the one who's going to be the next king. The next scene shows Lady Macbeth reading a letter that she's received from her husband. And the subject of the letter is Macbeth's meeting with the witches. It seems that she's even more enthusiastic about becoming queen than Macbeth is about becoming king. A messenger arrives to tell her that Duncan is going to be staying at the castle that night, and Lady Macbeth can't believe her luck. It turns out that Lady Macbeth immediately thinks of killing Duncan. Macbeth arrives, and they talk about the king arriving, and Lady Macbeth hears that he's leaving in the morning, and basically says he's not going anywhere in the morning because he's not going to be around in the morning. Now, she tells Macbeth to behave himself and pretend that he's being nice, and that she'll take care of the rest. When Duncan arrives at Macbeth's castle, he doesn't know that the Macbeths are already planning to murder him. So there's a huge amount of irony involved in him arriving at Macbeth's castle and saying what a lovely castle it is. Isn't it lovely round here? The air's so nice. And then Lady Macbeth comes out to meet them, and she's super nice. And Duncan's like, isn't Lady Macbeth a lovely woman? I think I'm going to have a lovely stay here at Castle Macbeth. And the scene ends with an act between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth talking about murdering Duncan. And we can see that it's Lady Macbeth who's trying to convince her husband that murdering Duncan is a good idea. More of that scene later. Act 2 begins with Banquo and his son Fleance on a kind of guard duty. They're up late at night, there's a torch. Macbeth arrives and Banquo says to him, aren't you in bed yet? The king's already in bed. Why aren't you in bed? Oh, and by the way, the king asked me to give you this giant diamond for your wife for being such a lovely woman and for being such a great hostess. And then there's a bit of chit chat and Banquo says, I was thinking about the witches the other night, and Macbeth says, oh, I never think about them at all. So they say goodnight and they leave, and Macbeth has this strange apparition where he can see a dagger in the air, and he sees it as an omen, as a sign that he needs to go murder Duncan. So the next thing that happens is that Duncan's been killed, Macbeth's covered in blood, he's holding 2 daggers which he was supposed to leave at the murder scene. He won't take them back, so Lady Macbeth has to do it herself. It appears that Macbeth is already losing it and saying things like, Macbeth doth murder sleep, because Duncan was asleep when Macbeth murdered him. And it's Lady Macbeth who has to steady the ship. She has to take the daggers back into the room where Duncan's been murdered. She's the one who tells Macbeth to wash the blood off his hands, and that they need to put on their night clothes as if they've been asleep the whole time. As this is happening, and as they're getting the alibi together, we can hear knocking. And as the Macbeths exit, because Macbeth has this idea that it's Duncan who's doing the knocking, the ghost of Duncan knocking. But it's not, it's somebody knocking at the door. And it's the porter who arrives after the Macbeths have exited the stage. The porter turns up, and it appears that it's Macduff and Lennox who are at the door, who've arrived, and it's morning time. The porter has some jokes about sex and alcohol. It provokes desire, but it takes away performance, he says. Macbeth arrives, it's morning time, and Macduff goes to get the king, whilst Macbeth talks to Lennox about the king as if he's still alive. But he's not still alive, he's dead. Macduff comes back, raises the alarm, and there's a general commotion. Lady Macbeth is more shocked than anybody, and Macbeth was so angry he killed the 2 guards that were covered in blood holding the 2 daggers next to the king. Malcolm and Donalbain, the king's sons, suspect that Macbeth might be responsible for this, so to deflect attention away from the situation, Lady Macbeth has some sort of a fit or faints, so that people have to help her out of the room. And Macbeth says, look, why don't we all meet up and discuss the situation down in the main room, and everybody agrees that that's a good idea and leave. But at that point, Malcolm and Donalbain have a chat about how the murder is going to get pinned on them, and Malcolm says he's going to leave for England, and Donalbain says he's going to leave for Ireland before there's any meetings and before they get pinned with an accusation of killing the king. In the next scene, it's apparent that time has passed, and Ross is talking to an old man about how many strange things have happened since the king's death. Macduff enters and explains that since the king's sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, have fled, it looks as if the suspicion has fallen on them. And Ross says that, well then, the sovereignty will fall upon Macbeth. And Macduff says, it certainly looks that way. And Ross says, well, are you going to Macbeth's coronation? And Macduff says, no, I don't think I'll bother. I'm going back to Fife. I've had enough. And they all leave. And so at the end of Act 2, it looks very much as if the Macbeths have gotten away with murder, and Macbeth is about to be crowned the King of Scotland. Act 3 opens with Banquo, who speaks about the fact that Macbeth has got everything that the witches predicted for him, but he suspects that Macbeth hasn't come by it honestly. Thou played most foully for it, he says. But then Macbeth enters as king with Lady Macbeth and Lennox and Ross and the attendants, and Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are super nice to Banquo, which is never a good sign, and he's super nice back, even though he's just suggested that he suspects the Macbeths of murdering Duncan. So the Macbeth say, you must come to dinner. We're having a big party and we want you to be there. And Banquo says, I wouldn't miss it for the world, but before supper I need to go for a ride on my horse. And Macbeth says, well, don't go too far now because we're expecting you for supper later. Bye. And then as soon as Banquo's gone, he calls in a couple of murderers and sets up Banquo's murder, where the murderers can find him, what time he's going to be there, to make sure that they'll make the hit. So they leave, and Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have a conversation where it's apparent that Macbeth is not a very happy camper, and Lady Macbeth is trying to make him feel better about himself, but is not being very successful. So then we have the scene of Banquo's murder. And Banquo and Fleance are ambushed by the murderers, and Banquo does his best to stop the murderers from getting to his son Fleance, who escapes whilst Banquo is murdered, saving his son. Back at the castle, supper's started and the guests are arriving. And everyone's being nice and courteous, and everyone's being very proper and polite. And then at the door, one of the murderers appear, and Macbeth goes over to talk to him. And the murderer tells Macbeth that Banquo's dead, but Fleance has escaped. And Macbeth is delighted that Banquo's dead, but is very upset that Fleance has escaped. And he starts getting distracted by the fact until Lady Macbeth comes over to him and says, you're neglecting your guest, darling, so you need to get back to the supper, which is what happens. Macbeth goes back to the supper, but no sooner has he got back there than Banquo's ghost turns up, and Macbeth starts freaking out. Lady Macbeth tries to cover things over for him by saying that Macbeth's always been a bit funny, that he's had these funny turns since he was young, and you just need to ignore it. And then she tells Macbeth to pull himself together. The ghost leaves and Macbeth calms down, and he tells everybody that he's fine. But then the ghost comes back and Macbeth completely loses it. This time Lady Macbeth can't cover up for it. The supper's broken up and everyone has to leave. And people notice that there's something wrong with Macbeth. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are left alone after everybody's gone. Macbeth still seems to be freaking out. But he's mad at Macduff for not turning up for the supper. And he says that he's going to go and speak to the witches again. Now there's a scene here with the witches and Hecate, which is usually dropped in most productions and is disputed as being part of the play by some Shakespeare scholars. It's a very generic scene where Hecate's supposed to be like king of the witches and the devil's servants, and it shows how evil and nasty they are. So the scene that comes after that is Lennox and a lord basically discussing the political situation as it now stands. And Lennox points out that, well, Duncan's dead and Malcolm and Donalbain fled the country, and therefore they were supposed to be the ones who killed Duncan. Well, now Banquo's dead and Fleance has fled. Does that mean that Fleance is the main suspect of killing his own father? Well, obviously not. And there's a sense in which Lennox is not only telling us the political situation, but how little anybody believes in it anymore. He also tells us that Macduff has gone to England, where Malcolm is staying at the court of King Edward of England, and that Macduff is thinking of, he's trying to put together an army to go against Macbeth. Macbeth has summoned him to the castle, and that's not going to happen. And Lennox and the Lord both fear that things are not going to end happily for Macduff. And that's where we end Act 3. Act 4 starts with the big scene between Macbeth and the witches. So Macbeth's not happy with his current political situation, and he's not very happy with his own mental health. He's not sleeping, he's tormented by images of death and murder, and it seems as if his power is slipping away. So he's gone to the witches to find some sort of consolation in the abilities to see into the future. In response to Macbeth's requests, the witches show Macbeth 3 apparitions. The first is a head which tells him to beware of Macduff and then disappears. The witches tell Macbeth that he can't ask them any questions, that they'll speak what they have to say, but he can't talk to them. So the second apparition is a bloody child who tells Macbeth that he can't be harmed by a man who is, quote, of woman born. And Macbeth takes that as being that he's invincible because, well, everybody has a mother, everybody's been born of a mother. If he can't be killed by somebody who is not of woman born, then he's fine. And the third apparition is a child wearing a crown who tells Macbeth that he can't be beaten until Great Burnham Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come. That's suggesting that he's not going to lose a battle until the woods near the castle have moved up to the castle. And Macbeth takes this as meaning that he can't lose a battle because woods can't move, forests don't walk about, so therefore he can't lose a battle. But finally Macbeth demands to know if Banquo will be the father of the kings, and after some equivocation the witches show him a procession of kings going back to Banquo. The apparition fades, the witches disappear, and Macbeth is left alone. Enter Lennox to speak to Macbeth, and Macbeth says, "Did you not see the weird sisters? They must have passed you along the way." But Lennox saw nothing about them at all, and Macbeth seems distracted. But Lennox tells him that Macduff has gone to England, and Macbeth is infuriated by this and says that he's going to kill he's going to go to Macduff's castle, kill his wife, kill his children, and anyone else who's connected with Macduff. In the next scene, Lady Macduff and her son are discussing the situation and how things have deteriorated in Scotland. The murderers turn up, they kill Lady Macduff and her kids, and after that we have the scene with Malcolm and Macduff discussing the situation in England and in Scotland, and they talk about how bad and evil Macbeth has become in comparison with good King Edward of England, where they now live and who they've seen in action. Ross arrives and they ask him about how things are in Scotland, and Ross tells Macduff that his wife and kids have been slaughtered by Macbeth, and Macduff says he's going to use his grief to get his revenge on Macbeth, and they all agree that now is the time for Macbeth to be confronted and done away with, and that's where Act 4. Act 5 begins with the Doctor and the Lady-in-Waiting talking about Lady Macbeth's health. She's doing a lot of sleepwalking, in which she writes letters and carries candles and so forth. And as they're talking about her, Lady Macbeth appears sleepwalking and starts washing her hands. She starts talking about the old man, that means King Duncan, and the Thane of Fife's wife, e.g. Lady Macduff. When Lady Macbeth exits, the Doctor and the Lady-in-Waiting know exactly what she's talking about. The next scene, Macbeth's soldiers wait for the battle, but are not convinced of what they're fighting for. Macbeth is sure he cannot be defeated because of the witch's predictions, but prepares for battle by putting on his armour. He tells the Doctor to cure Lady Macbeth, and the Doctor wishes he was somewhere else. The forces of Malcolm are commanded to cut down a branch of the forest to use it as camouflage. Meanwhile, Macbeth and his soldiers are getting ready for battle when Macbeth learns that Lady Macbeth is dead. He is indifferent to her demise, and then the messenger turns up to tell Macbeth that the wood is moving And Macbeth flies into a rage and exits with the line, "At least we'll die with harness on our back." Harness being armour, kind of like in the cowboy movies when they talk about they died with their boots on. So the battle's getting closer and things are not looking good for Macbeth. Malcolm tells his soldiers to drop their branches and charge. Macbeth realises that he's trapped in the castle, but clings to the witch's prediction that he can't be killed by a man, quote, "of woman born." First, Macbeth comes up against young Siward and kills him and says to the effect of, "Looks like you were born of a woman." We see Macduff looking for Macbeth on the battlefield. He can't find him. He wants revenge. Malcolm and Siward enter the castle. Finally, Macduff and Macbeth come face to face, and Macbeth says that he can't be killed by any man to one of woman born. And Macduff says, "Despair thy charm. Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped." In other words, he was born by caesarean section, so he wasn't technically born of woman. They exit fighting. Malcolm and Siwald enter. Ross tells Siwald that his son has been killed in battle and that he's dead, and Siwald says, "Why then, God's soldier be he." Macduff enters with Macbeth's head in a bag. Most productions, a cabbage is normally used. Everybody cheers because the tyrant is dead, and Malcolm is pronounced king. There's just enough time for Malcolm to make a speech telling us that Lady Macbeth killed herself and that everything's going to be great. He's going to get everybody back to the Kingdom of Scotland, and they're all going to start a good kingdom with a good king. So that's just a quick overview of what happens in Macbeth, the story of the play. Did you enjoy this podcast? You did? Well, in that case, press the like button and subscribe so that your enjoyment will be imprinted on the universe forever. If you didn't like this podcast, don't you dare press the like button, and under no circumstances should you subscribe. Damn that reverse psychology. It works every time.